September 1944. Hans Miller stood on the cold dock in Liverpool, England, and stared at the gray ship that would carry him across the Atlantic Ocean. He was 28 years old, he had one leg, and he was certain he was going to die in Canada. The wooden crutch dug into his armpit as he shifted his weight. His left leg ended just below the knee now. A British shell had taken it at Normandy 3 months ago. The stump still hurt every morning when he woke up. Sometimes he could still feel his missing foot, like a ghost that refused to leave. The British had patched him up in a field hospital. Then they sent him to a holding camp with other wounded German soldiers. For weeks Hans had wondered what would happen to disabled prisoners like him, men who could not work, men who could not fight. Men the Nazi officers called useless mouths to feed. Now he knew. They were sending all the disabled Germans to Canada. 200 men with missing arms, missing legs, bad lungs, or wounds that would never fully heal. The Nazi propaganda officers had been very clear about what Canadians did to prisoners. They were savage colonial troops, the officers said. They took no prisoners on the battlefield. They showed no mercy to the weak. Hans had heard stories from other soldiers. The Canadians bayoneted wounded men. They shot prisoners for sport. They were animals who lived in a frozen wasteland at the edge of the world. And now Hans and 200 other disabled men were being shipped there like cattle to slaughter. "They will work us to death in their mines," said a voice beside him. Hans turned to see Oberfeldwebel Karl Weber, a career soldier from Prussia. Weber was 35 years old, with a thin face and tired eyes. His right arm ended at the elbow. He had lost it in North Africa 2 years ago, fighting under Rommel in the desert. An Iron Cross medal sat pinned to his worn uniform jacket. Before the war, Weber had been a proud German soldier. Now he looked like a man who had stopped hoping for anything good. "Maybe they will not bother with the mines," Weber continued in a flat voice. "Maybe they will just shoot us when we arrive. It would be quicker." Hans wanted to argue, but he could not find the words. What could he say? That everything would be fine? He did not believe that himself. His mother back in Bavaria had cried when he left for war. She had begged him not to go. He had kissed her cheek and promised he would return. That promise felt like a lifetime ago. Now he would die on the other side of the world, and she would never know what happened to him. The thought made his chest feel tight. A younger voice cut through his dark thoughts. "They are taking us across the ocean to kill us where no one will know." Hans looked at the third man in their small group. Friedrich Klein was only 22 years old, but his eyes looked much older. Everyone called him Fritz. He had been a volunteer in the Hitler Youth before joining the Wehrmacht. Shrapnel from an artillery shell had torn through his right leg in France. He walked with a heavy limp now, dragging his foot with each step. Fritz had grown up in Cologne and believed every word the Nazi Party told him. He still wore his faith in the Führer like armor, even as that faith cracked around the edges. "They will torture us first," Fritz said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "That is what the enemy does. They will make examples of us." Weber glanced at the younger man, but said nothing. Hans noticed how Weber's jaw tightened. The older soldier had stopped believing in Nazi promises a long time ago. But even Weber expected the worst from their captors. Why would the Canadians treat them well? Germany had bombed Britain for years. German submarines had sunk Canadian ships. German soldiers had killed their brothers and sons. No, Hans thought, they have every reason to hate us. The September wind blew cold off the water. It carried the smell of salt and oil and fish. Hans pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. He owned almost nothing now. The clothes on his back, his crutch. A a small bag with one spare shirt and his identification papers. Everything else was gone. His tools from his carpentry apprenticeship, his father's pocket watch, the photograph of his mother. All of it lost somewhere between Normandy and this miserable dock. Behind them, British guards shouted orders in English. Hans understood a few words now after months as a prisoner. Move, line, ship, go. The guards pushed the disabled Germans into a long line. Some men limped, others leaned on crutches or were carried on stretchers. One man was blind from poison gas. 2 more had been burned so badly their faces looked like melted candles. Hans felt sick looking at them. This is what we have become, he thought, broken pieces of a broken army. The ship loomed larger as they shuffled forward. It was a transport vessel, painted gray with rust stains running down its sides. The name on the bow was in English, which Hans could not read. A Canadian flag hung from the mast, red and white with a maple leaf. Hans had never seen that flag before. It looked strange and foreign. 12 days to cross the Atlantic, Weber said quietly. If we survive the crossing, then we face whatever waits on the other side. Fritz spat on the dock. We should have fought to the death. Better to die with honor than be sent to that frozen hell. Hans said nothing. He had thought about dying many times since Normandy. Sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, death seemed easier than living with one leg and no future. But some stubborn part of him still wanted to live, still wanted to see his mother again. Still wanted to feel sawdust between his fingers as he worked wood into something beautiful. That small flame of hope refused to go out, even when logic told him it should. The line moved forward. Hans gripped his crutch tighter and took a step toward the ship. His phantom foot ached. His real foot slipped on the wet dock. Weber steadied him with his remaining hand. Fritz limped ahead without looking back. Around them, 200 disabled German soldiers moved like ghosts toward a ship that would carry them to an unknown fate. Hans looked one last time at the gray English sky. Then he looked at the gray ocean stretching endlessly toward the west. Somewhere across that water was Canada. Somewhere across that water was whatever came next. He did not know if he would survive it. He did not know if he wanted to. But the line kept moving, and Hans kept walking because that was all he could do now. Walk forward into the unknown and hope that death, when it came, would be quick. The British guards led them up a metal ramp onto the ship. Hans expected to be shoved into the cargo hold like animals. That was what happened when Germany moved prisoners. You packed them tight in the dark belly of trains or ships. You gave them nothing and expected them to survive or not. It did not matter which. But the Canadian guard at the top of the ramp pointed down a different corridor. "Berths are below, fellows," he said in accented German. "Find yourself a bunk." Hans blinked. Fellows? The guard had called them fellows, like they were soldiers instead of prisoners. Hans glanced at Weber, who frowned but said nothing. They followed the other disabled men down steep metal stairs into the ship's lower deck. Hans struggled with his crutch on the stairs. His stump throbbed with each awkward step down. A hand grabbed his elbow, steadying him. Hans turned and saw a young Canadian guard with red hair and freckles. "Easy there," the guard said. "These stairs are murder with a crutch. I've got you." Hans stared at the guard. The man was helping him. Not mocking, not shoving, actually helping. The guard's name tag read Mackenzie. He stayed beside Hans until they reached the bottom, then nodded and moved on to help another man. The sleeping area was nothing like Hans expected. Instead of one large room packed with hammocks or bare floors, there were actual berths built into the walls. Small beds stacked too high, with thin mattresses and blankets. Hans ran his hand over the blanket. It was rough wool, but it was clean. He could not remember the last time he had slept on something clean. "This is wrong," Fritz muttered, claiming a lower bunk nearby. "This is too good. They are planning something." Weber took the bunk above Hans without comment. His face showed nothing, but Hans noticed how carefully the older man touched his mattress, like he was afraid it might disappear. The ship left Liverpool that evening. For 2 days, Hans waited for the cruelty to begin, but it did not come. On the second morning, guards came through with small boxes. Red Cross parcels, they called them. Each prisoner received one. Inside, Hans found things he had not seen in over a year: real chocolate, a pack of cigarettes, a small bar of soap that smelled like flowers. His hand shook as he held the chocolate. It was Swiss, with writing in German on the wrapper. He broke off one square and put it on his tongue. The sweetness made his eyes water. "They fatten us before slaughter," Fritz said, eating his own chocolate while trying to look angry. "Like livestock." But Hans noticed Fritz ate every piece. Twice each day, guards brought hot soup in big metal containers. The soup had real potatoes in it. Sometimes there were bits of meat. It was thin soup, but it was hot and there was enough for everyone. Hans watched the guards serve themselves from the same containers. They ate the same food the prisoners ate. This made no sense. German guards always ate better than prisoners. That was how it worked. But here, the Canadians ate beside them like it was nothing unusual. The crossing took 12 days. Each day brought small moments that did not fit what Hans expected. Guards walked the deck with rifles, but Hans never saw them point the weapons at prisoners. The guards were not tense or cruel. Some of them even smiled. Hans heard them laughing with each other during their breaks, the sound carrying down through the metal walls. It was strange to hear your captors laugh. It made them seem human instead of just enemy soldiers. On the 5th day, Hans climbed the stairs to the deck for fresh air. The same guard, Mackenzie, was there. He helped Hans again without being asked. "Getting your sea legs?" Mackenzie said in broken German. Hans managed a small nod. The ocean stretched in every direction, gray-green water under gray-white clouds. The salt spray hit his face. The wind was cold, but felt good after the stuffy sleeping area below. He was allowed 2 hours on deck each day. All the prisoners were. 2 hours to walk around, to breathe real air, to see the sky. Weber joined him at the rail. They stood in silence, watching the waves. Finally, Weber spoke, his voice low. "The guards eat what we eat." "I noticed," Hans said. "In Africa, our guards ate bread and sausage while we got water and stale crackers." Weber paused. "This is different." Fritz limped over, his bad leg dragging slightly. "It means nothing. Wait until we reach Canada. That is when it will start." But Hans saw doubt in Fritz's eyes now. The young man's faith in Nazi propaganda was starting to crack, just a little. You could not eat real chocolate and hot soup for 12 days and still fully believe you were being taken to your death. The human brain did not work that way. The ship docked in Halifax in early October. British guards transferred them to Canadian custody at the port. The processing happened in a large building that looked more like a train station than a prison. There were desks with papers. There were doctors with stethoscopes. A Canadian officer with white hair and glasses asked Hans questions in perfect German. What had been his profession before the war? Did he have any medical conditions besides his missing leg? What skills did he have? Hans answered carefully, confused by the questions. Why did they care about his carpentry skills? Why did it matter what he could do? The doctor examined his leg stump with gentle hands. He asked if it hurt. He made notes on a paper. "We will get you a better prosthetic," the doctor said. "The British one is poorly fitted." Hans stared at him. A better artificial leg? Why would the enemy give him a better leg? Weber came out of his examination looking troubled. They asked about my education, he said quietly. They asked if I liked to read. Fritz said nothing. His face was pale. The doctor had examined his damaged leg for almost an hour and prescribed something called physical therapy. In Germany, disabled soldiers were lucky to get bandages. Here, the enemy was offering to help them heal. They loaded onto a train that same afternoon, not cattle cars, passenger cars with actual seats and windows without bars or boards. Hans sat and watched Canada roll past outside. Forests thick with trees, fields with crops, small towns with houses that had glass in every window and paint on the walls. At one station, Weber counted 47 automobiles parked in neat rows. 47 cars in one small town. It is a trick, Fritz whispered, but his voice had no strength behind the words. They're showing us their best parts. Hans said nothing. He pressed his hand against the cool glass and watched a country he was supposed to hate look more whole and healthy than Germany had in 5 years. Something was very wrong with what they had been taught, or something was very right with what they were seeing now. Hans did not know which scared him more. The train carried them west for 3 more days. When it finally stopped in Medicine Hat, Alberta, Hans stepped onto the platform and felt his breath catch. The air was different here, cleaner somehow, colder. It smelled like grass and distant mountains instead of smoke and oil. Trucks waited to take them the last few miles to the camp. Hans sat in the back with Weber and Fritz, watching the flat prairie land stretch forever under a huge sky. There were no bomb craters, no burned buildings, no refugees crowding the roads. Just open space and a peace so complete it felt unreal. The camp appeared over a small hill. Hans had expected barbed wire fences like prison camps in Germany, tall walls, guard towers with machine guns. But what he saw made his stomach twist with confusion. The camp covered maybe 30 acres of flat ground. There were wooden barracks painted brown and green. Regular buildings, not pens or cages. A Canadian flag flew from a tall pole in the center. They passed through a simple gate. One guard checked papers. That was all. Inside, Hans saw other prisoners walking freely between buildings. Some were working in a garden. Others sat on benches in the afternoon sun. No one looked starved or beaten. No one cowered when guards walked past. The truck stopped in front of a long barracks. A Canadian officer with a clipboard directed groups of men to different buildings. Hans, Weber, and Fritz were assigned to Barrack 12 with 40 other disabled prisoners. They walked inside, Hans struggling with his crutch on the wooden steps. The door opened into a long room with windows on both sides, real glass windows that let in sunlight. Down each wall stood metal bed frames. Not straw on the floor, not hammocks packed tight. Actual beds with mattresses and pillows. Each bed had 2 thick blankets folded at the foot. Between every 2 beds stood a small wooden locker. Hans touched the nearest bed. The mattress gave under his hand, soft and real. He sat down slowly, afraid it might break or disappear. The bed held him. It was sturdy and clean and more comfortable than anything he had slept on in 3 years. "Where are the chains?" Fritz said, his voice high and strange. "Where are the cells?" A German prisoner already living in the barrack looked up from his bunk. He was an older man with a bandaged hand. "There are no cells," he said. "This is where we sleep. Pick a bunk. They will call us for dinner soon." Fritz stood frozen in the middle of the room. Weber walked past him and claimed a bunk near the back. Hans took the one next to Weber. He sat and stared at his locker. He owned almost nothing, but they gave him a locker anyway, a place to keep things, like he was a person instead of just a prisoner. At one end of the room was a common area with chairs and a small table. A radio sat on a shelf. Hans could hear it playing music softly. At the other end, a door led to a bathroom. Hans limped over and looked inside. There were sinks with running water, toilets that flushed. Everything was clean. The smell of soap and disinfectant was strong, but not unpleasant. Back in Germany, even before the war, only wealthy people had indoor plumbing. Here, in a prisoner camp, they had it like it was normal. A bell rang outside. The older prisoner with the bandaged hand stood up. "Dinner," he said. "The mess hall is the big building across the yard. Do not be late. They are strict about mealtimes." Hans, Weber, and Fritz followed other prisoners across the open yard. The mess hall was huge, maybe big enough for 200 men at once. Long tables with benches filled the space. The floor was swept clean. More windows let in light. At one end, German prisoners lined up with metal trays. Canadian guards stood nearby, but they were not watching closely. They were just there. Hans got in line. When he reached the front, a Canadian soldier with a big spoon filled his tray. A scoop of porridge, thick and steaming. 2 slices of bread with real butter spread on top. A spoonful of jam. A cup of coffee that smelled rich and dark. The soldier added sugar to the coffee without asking. Hans carried his tray to a table, his hands shaking slightly. Weber and Fritz sat across from him. For a long moment, they all just stared at their food. Hans picked up the bread and bit into it. The butter melted on his tongue. The bread was soft and fresh. He could not remember the last time he had tasted butter. Maybe 1942? Before that? The porridge was hot and filling. The coffee was strong and sweet. Hans ate slowly, trying to make it last. Around him, other prisoners ate without speaking much. The room was quiet, except for the sound of spoons on metal trays. But it was not the tense quiet of frightened men. It was the comfortable quiet of people eating a good meal. "This is more food than Wehrmacht soldiers get now," Hans said quietly. He had done the math in his head. This one meal was maybe 800 calories, maybe more. If they ate 3 meals like this every day, that was well over 2,000 calories. German soldiers at the front were lucky to get 1,500. Weber looked at his empty tray. No one watched to make sure we did not take too much. Fritz had eaten everything on his tray. Now he sat with his arms crossed, his face hard. "Only because they need workers," he said. But Hans heard how weak the words sounded. Fritz was trying to hold on to his anger, but the food in his stomach made it difficult. That afternoon, a Canadian doctor examined all the new arrivals. Hans waited his turn in a clean medical building that smelled like medicine and soap. When his name was called, he limped into a small room. The doctor was maybe 50 years old, with gray hair and kind eyes. His name tag read Robertson. Dr. Robertson spoke German well. He asked Hans to sit and remove his prosthetic leg. He examined the stump with careful hands, turning it gently, pressing lightly to check for pain. Hans flinched twice. The doctor made notes on paper. "The British did adequate work," Robertson said. "But this prosthetic does not fit correctly. See here? It rubs against the bone. That is why you have pain. We will make you a better one." Hans stared at him. "Why?" Robertson looked up from his notes. "Because you need one. Because you deserve to walk without pain." He said it like the answer was obvious. The examination took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of one enemy doctor's time spent on one disabled German prisoner. Robertson checked Hans's heart, his lungs, his remaining leg. November came cold and clear. Hans woke each morning to frost on the barrack windows. But inside, the building stayed warm. The Canadians heated every barrack with big metal stoves. Someone kept them filled with coal all day and night. The temperature never dropped below 68 degrees. Hans had a small thermometer a guard gave him. He checked it every morning, amazed that his enemy cared if he was warm. After breakfast, Hans reported to the carpentry workshop. The camp offered work to prisoners who wanted it. Not forced labor, actual jobs that paid money. Hans earned 25 cents each day he worked. The money went into a camp account. He could use it to buy things at the canteen like soap, cigarettes, or writing paper. The workshop was a large building that smelled like fresh wood and sawdust. That smell brought Hans back to Bavaria, to his apprenticeship before the war. His hands knew how to hold tools. His mind knew how to read wood grain. Even with one leg, he could still create things. That mattered more than he expected. The Canadian supervisor was a man named Henderson. He was maybe 60 years old with white hair and rough hands that showed a lifetime of woodworking. Henderson spoke no German, but wood was a language both men understood. He showed Hans the tools, saws that were sharper than anything Hans had used in Germany, electric drills that made work 10 times faster, sanders powered by motors instead of muscle. They were building desks and chairs for local schools. Henderson demonstrated how he wanted the joints cut. Hans watched carefully, then tried it himself. His first cut was crooked. Henderson did not yell or hit him. He just showed Hans again, slower this time, pointing out where the blade should enter the wood. Hans tried again. Better. Good, Henderson said in English, giving him a thumbs up. Hans smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in months. Over weeks, Hans learned that Alberta spruce was lighter than Bavarian pine. It cut differently, held screws differently, finished differently. Henderson taught him Canadian techniques for joining wood. He treated Hans like an apprentice learning a trade, not an enemy forced to work. Sometimes Henderson brought coffee from his thermos, and they would sit together during breaks, not talking because they had no shared language, but comfortable in the silence of two craftsmen resting. Weber found himself assigned to the camp library after telling the intake officer he liked to read. The library was a small building with maybe 3,000 books on wooden shelves. Most were in English, but a whole section held German books. Weber ran his fingers along the spines. Goethe, Schiller, Heine, books that were banned in Germany for being too free in their thinking. Here they sat on open shelves for any prisoner to read. The library officer was Lieutenant Morrison, a thin man with glasses who had studied in Germany before the war. He spoke German like a native. Morrison showed Weber how the library worked, how to check books in and out, how to repair damaged spines, how to order new books from suppliers. "You have read Goethe?" Morrison asked one afternoon. Weber nodded. "In school, long ago." Morrison pulled a book from the shelf. "Try this, American author, Western Stories." It was a novel about cowboys and outlaws. Weber had never read anything like it. He took it to his bunk that night and read by the electric light until midnight. The next day he asked Morrison for another, and another. The worlds in those books were so different from his own experience that they felt like dreams. Morrison also discussed philosophy with Weber during slow afternoons. They talked about Kant and democracy and the nature of power. Morrison never lectured. He asked questions that made Weber think. What is the difference between patriotism and nationalism? Can a leader be great if his cause is evil? Weber had no good answers, but the questions lived in his mind for days. Fritz struggled more than the others. His leg hurt constantly. 3 times each week, a Canadian physical therapist worked with him. The therapist was a young woman named Sarah who spoke a little German. She moved Fritz's damaged leg through exercises that made him sweat and curse. But after each session, the leg moved a little easier. The limp grew less pronounced. Eventually, Fritz was assigned to work in the camp greenhouse. It was light duty, appropriate for his injury. The greenhouse was warm and humid, full of growing plants. Fritz had never gardened before. He did not know the names of most plants, but there was something peaceful about the work. Something that did not require thinking about the war or what came next. 2 Hutterite men worked in the greenhouse as civilian contractors. They were ethnic Germans who had come to Canada generations ago. They spoke German with an old-fashioned accent. They were also pacifists who refused to fight in any war. This confused Fritz terribly. Germans who would not fight for Germany? Who chose religion over nation? It made no sense in his mind. "You do not believe in defending your homeland?" Fritz asked one of them. The man, whose name was Jakob, smiled gently. "I believe in defending life. All life. Killing is always wrong, no matter who orders it." Fritz wanted to argue, wanted to call him a coward. But Jakob worked hard and treated Fritz with kindness. He showed Fritz how to water plants properly, how to check for disease, how to harvest vegetables. Jakob had strong hands and a peaceful face. He did not seem like a coward. He seemed like a man who had chosen a different path and found peace in it. December brought snow and a strange energy to the camp. The Canadians were preparing for Christmas. They hung decorations in the mess hall, green branches and red ribbons. The guards seemed happier, talking about going home on leave to see families. On Christmas Eve, something unexpected happened. The mess hall was decorated with a tree covered in candles and paper ornaments. Dinner was special. Real turkey with stuffing, potatoes with gravy, vegetables, pie with cream. Hans stared at his plate. This was more food than he had seen in one place since before the war started. The taste of turkey made his throat tight with unexpected emotion. He was eating better as a prisoner than he had as a free man. After dinner, some guards brought their children to the camp, little boys and girls in winter coats, their cheeks red from cold. They sang Christmas songs in English. Hans did not understand the words, but he understood the music. The children were not afraid of the German prisoners. Their parents had brought them to sing for the enemy. What kind of people did that? Fritz watched the children with something like pain in his eyes. He had believed Canadians were monsters, but monsters did not have children who sang with innocent voices. Monsters did not serve turkey to their prisoners. Monsters did not fix your prosthetic leg, or teach you about books, or show you how to grow tomatoes in winter. In January, Hans tried to write to his mother. He sat in the common room with paper and pencil that cost him 3 days of wages from the canteen. He wanted to tell her everything, about the food and the heat and the kindness, about Henderson and the carpentry shop, about sleeping in a real bed every night. But the camp censors would not allow detailed descriptions of camp conditions. It might help the enemy, they said. So Hans wrote simply, "I am safe, I am fed. Do not worry about me. I will see you when this is over." He did not mention that he was safer and better fed than she probably was. That guilt sat heavy in his chest. Weber wrote to his wife in February. He had more he wanted to say than Hans did. He wanted to tell Greta that everything they had been taught was lies, that the enemy was showing them more humanity than their own leaders ever had. But the censors would cut that out. So he wrote, "I work with books. I think of you and the children every day. Wait for me. When I return, we will talk about many things." Fritz wrote nothing. He had no family left. His parents had died in the bombing of Cologne. He had no siblings. No one waited for him back in Germany. Sometimes Hans saw Fritz sitting alone in the evening, staring at nothing. The young man was beginning to understand something terrible. He had given everything to a cause that used him and threw him away, and now his enemy was treating him better than his own side ever had. That knowledge was breaking something inside Fritz that might never fully heal. By March, Hans had built 16 desks for Canadian schoolchildren. His new prosthetic leg fit properly and barely hurt at all. The news reached Medicine Hat on May 7th, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hans heard it on the common room radio and felt his whole body go numb. Around him, other German prisoners reacted in different ways. Some cried, some sat in silence, some refused to believe it. Germany could not be defeated. The Führer would never surrender. But the radio kept saying it was true, over and over in English, then in German. The war was done. Fritz did not come out of his bunk all day. He lay facing the wall, with his blanket pulled over his head. Hans tried to talk to him, but Fritz would not respond. Weber sat in the library for hours, not reading, just staring at the same page. Hans went to the carpentry shop, but could not focus. His hand shook when he tried to cut wood. Henderson noticed and sent him back to the barracks early, with a gentle pat on the shoulder. That night, Hans lay awake listening to men cry in the darkness. Some wept for joy that the killing was over. Others wept because everything they believed had died with Germany's surrender. Hans felt both things at once: relief that he would not die in this camp, horror at what would happen to his mother and everyone back home. Germany was destroyed. What was left for any of them? The next day was May 8th, VE Day, the Canadians called it. Victory in Europe Day. The camp commander gathered all the prisoners in the morning. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious face. He spoke in English first, then a translator repeated his words in German. "The war is over," the commander said. "There will be no reprisals against any of you, no punishment, no revenge. You will continue to be treated according to international law and human decency. The guards have been instructed to celebrate appropriately, but not in ways that would hurt or mock you. You are still under our protection." Hans felt tears burn his eyes. Even now, even in victory, they would not be cruel. What kind of enemy does that? The Canadian guards tried to contain their happiness, but it leaked through anyway. Hans saw them smiling, shaking hands, clapping each other on the back. By evening, someone had set up music in the mess hall. Not a celebration exactly, but a gathering. Guards and prisoners mixed together at the long tables. The meal was the same as always, but the air felt different, heavier. Like the weight of 5 years was finally lifting, but no one knew what came after. Hans sat at a table with Weber and Fritz. Fritz had finally come out of the barracks, but his face was pale and empty. Weber ate slowly, methodically, like a man going through motions he no longer believed in. Hans pushed food around his tray without much appetite. Footsteps approached. Hans looked up and saw Corporal Mackenzie standing there with his own dinner tray. Mackenzie was the guard from the ship, the one who had helped Hans with his crutch, the one who always called them fellows instead of prisoners. He was maybe 30 years old with red hair that was starting to thin. "Mind if I sit?" Mackenzie asked in his rough German. Hans shook his head. Mackenzie sat down across from them. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of other conversations filled the space. Somewhere, a radio played quiet music. Mackenzie ate a few bites, then put down his fork. "I know this is hard for you fellows," Mackenzie said. "War's over now. Time to think about going home." Hans found his voice, though it came out rough. "Why did you treat us this way? We were your enemy." Mackenzie looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He laid it on the table between them. The photo showed a young man in a Canadian uniform smiling at the camera. "My brother," Mackenzie said. "Tommy. He died at Dieppe in 1942. He was 19 years old." Hans stared at the photo. Weber leaned forward to see. Fritz did not move. "German machine guns killed him on the beach," Mackenzie continued. His voice was steady but quiet. "I got the letter a month later. I was already in the army by then. I had every reason to hate you, every reason to want revenge." He picked up the photo and looked at it. "But you know what I realized? You're just a kid with one leg, trying to survive. You didn't kill Tommy. You're just a carpenter from Bavaria who got drafted and lost his leg. What good would it do to be cruel to you?" Mackenzie put the photo back in his pocket. "My brother wouldn't want me to torture prisoners. That's not what we're fighting for. If we become monsters to defeat monsters, then what's the point? We lose anyway." Hans felt something break inside his chest. A wall he had been building since Normandy, since the British hospital, since the ship crossing. All the little cracks from months of unexpected kindness finally split wide open. Tears ran down his face. He could not stop them. "You're going home to rebuild," Mackenzie said. "Can't rebuild if you're full of hate and broken. Someone has to break the cycle. Might as well be us." Hans put his face in his hands and sobbed. He cried for Tommy Mackenzie, who died at 19. He cried for his own lost leg and lost years. He cried for every moment of kindness he had not deserved. Weber reached over and gripped his shoulder. Even Weber's eyes were wet. Across the table, Fritz sat rigid as stone. His jaw was clenched so tight Hans could see the muscles jumping. But his eyes were wide and glossy. Something was crumbling behind them. Later that evening, Hans saw Weber walking with Lieutenant Morrison near the library. Morrison held a book. He gave it to Weber with both hands, like it was something important. Hans was too far away to hear what they said, but he saw Weber take the book and press it against his chest. Weber's shoulders shook once. Morrison put a hand on Weber's arm and said something. Weber nodded. Hans found out later what the book was. All Quiet on the Western Front. A German novel about World War I that the Nazis had banned for telling the truth about war. Morrison had given Weber the thing his own government had forbidden him to read. That night Hans could not sleep. He kept thinking about Mackenzie's brother, about the photo of a smiling 19-year-old boy who never came home. Mackenzie had carried that grief for 3 years. He had a right to hate, a right to cruelty. But he chose something else. He chose to prove that his values were stronger than his pain. Hans understood something then that changed everything. The Canadians had not defeated Germany just with weapons. They had defeated the idea of Germany. They had proved that you could be strong without being brutal. That you could win without becoming the thing you fought against. They had won the war, but more importantly, they had won the argument. In the bunk below, Hans heard Fritz whisper something. It was so quiet, Hans almost missed it. "What have we done?" Fritz said to the darkness. "What have we done?" No one answered, but the question hung in the air like smoke. It would not go away. It would follow them forever. The only question now was what they would do with it, whether they would let it destroy them or use it to build something better. Outside, spring rain began to fall on the Alberta prairie. The sound was soft against the barrack roof. Gentle, like the world washing itself clean. The days after Germany's surrender were strange and heavy. Hans started attending English classes in the library. Lieutenant Morrison taught them twice a week. 10 German prisoners sat at tables learning words like house and work and friend. Hans practiced writing his name in English letters. He repeated simple sentences until his mouth learned the shapes. "My name is Hans. I am from Bavaria. I want to learn." Morrison was patient when Hans struggled with difficult sounds. The TI sound did not exist in German. Hans kept saying this instead of this. Morrison would smile and demonstrate again, putting his tongue between his teeth. Hans tried and tried until he got it right. "Why do you want to learn English?" Morrison asked him one afternoon. Hans chose his words carefully in broken English. "I want to come back. After Germany. Come back here." Morrison nodded slowly. "You want to immigrate to Canada?" "Yes," Hans said. The word felt important in his mouth. That week, Hans wrote another letter to his mother. The censors were less strict now that the war had ended. Hans could finally tell her some truth. He sat in the common room with paper that cost him a week of carpentry wages. His hand shook as he wrote, "Mama, I must tell you what I have learned. The Canadians treated us with dignity I did not know could exist in wartime. They fed us when they could have starved us. They healed my leg when they could have left me in pain. They taught me skills when they could have worked me to death. And Mama, we deserved none of it. Do you know what Germany did? Do you know about the camps? I cannot return as the man who left. I am applying for Canadian immigration when they allow it. I hope you can understand. I love you. Hans." He posted the letter and felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Weber spent 3 days reading the book Morrison had given him. All Quiet on the Western Front told the story of young German soldiers in the First War. How they were fed lies about glory. How they died in mud for nothing. How the old men who started wars never had to fight them. Weber read it twice. Then he started writing his own thoughts in a journal Morrison gave him. "We were fed glory and fed hatred," Weber wrote in careful German script. "Both were poison. Both killed us from the inside, while we thought we were becoming strong. The Canadians showed us that real strength is choosing mercy when you have the power to destroy. We never learned that lesson. Now we must." But not everyone in the camp was changing. About 15% of the prisoners still believed in Nazi ideas. Most were SS officers or true believers, like Fritz had been. They sat together in the mess hall and refused to speak to prisoners who accepted Germany's defeat. They called men like Hans and Weber traitors. One afternoon, an SS officer named Richter confronted Hans in the carpentry shop. Richter had lost 3 fingers on his right hand, but still wore his uniform with pride. "You disgrace Germany," Richter hissed, "learning their language, planning to abandon your homeland. You are a traitor to the fatherland." Hans put down his saw and looked at Richter. "The fatherland I knew never existed. They lied to us about everything." "Germany will rise again," Richter said. "And men like you will be remembered as cowards who turned on their own people." "Germany built death camps," Hans said quietly. "Germany murdered millions. I did not turn on my people. My people turned into monsters, and I refused to be one." Richter's face went red. He raised his damaged hand like he wanted to strike Hans, but Henderson stepped between them. The Canadian supervisor did not speak German, but he understood tension. He pointed at Richter and then at the door. Richter left, but his eyes promised that this conversation was not over. Weber had similar confrontations. He tried to debate with the holdouts using logic and facts. He showed them newspaper articles about the concentration camps, about the gas chambers, about the millions murdered. Some men turned away. Some called him a liar. Some said the articles were Allied propaganda. "Even if it is true," one former officer said, "we were fighting for Germany's survival. Sometimes hard choices must be made." Weber stared at him. "Murdering children in gas chambers is not a hard choice. It is evil. There is no other word for it." The officer walked away. Weber sat in the library afterward, his head in his remaining hand. Morrison found him there. "Some men will never accept the truth," Morrison said gently. "You cannot save everyone, Carl, but you can save yourself." Fritz was the one who struggled most. He stopped going to the greenhouse. He barely ate. He sat on his bunk for hours staring at nothing. The young man, who had been so certain about everything, now seemed broken by doubt. Hans tried to talk to him, but Fritz turned away. Weber tried to share what he had learned, but Fritz covered his ears. "Leave me alone," Fritz said. "Just leave me alone." One morning, Fritz did not get up for breakfast. When Hans checked on him, Fritz was curled in a ball, his face pressed into his pillow. His whole body shook. Hans got Dr. Robertson. The doctor examined Fritz and spoke to him quietly in German. Fritz did not respond. Robertson had him moved to the camp hospital for observation. "Depression," the doctor said. "Very serious." Hans visited Fritz in the hospital the next day. Fritz looked smaller somehow, lying in the clean white bed. His eyes were red from crying. "Why are you kind to me?" Fritz said suddenly. His voice was rough. "I believed we should destroy people like you. I believed Jews should die. I believed Slavs were subhuman. I believed all of it, every evil word." "Why do you still care what happens to me?" Hans sat in the chair beside the bed. "Because you do not believe those things anymore. That is what matters." "But I did believe them," Fritz said. "I gave my childhood to Hitler Youth. I volunteered to fight. I helped spread their poison. How do I live with that?" Dr. Robertson came in before Hans could answer. He pulled up another chair. "You live with it by learning from it, Friedrich, by understanding how propaganda works, by never letting yourself be used that way again, and by helping others avoid the same mistakes." Fritz turned his face to the wall. "I have nothing left, no family in Germany, no home, no future, just shame." Robertson spoke firmly. "You have a future if you choose to build one. You are 22 years old. You have 50 or 60 more years ahead of you. You can waste them on guilt, or you can use them to do some good in the world. That is your choice." Over the next week, Robertson worked with Fritz every day. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence. Slowly, Fritz started eating again, started getting out of bed. Robertson started group meetings for prisoners struggling with similar guilt. 8 men met twice a week in a small room. They talked about what they had believed and why, about how they had been manipulated, about how to move forward. Fritz attended every meeting. He said little at first, but he listened. In July, more news reached the camp. Complete reports about the concentration camps, photographs of the ovens, survivor testimonies, numbers so large they did not seem real. 6 million Jews, millions of others. The details were horrifying. Many prisoners refused to believe it. Allied lies, they said. Propaganda to make us accept defeat. But Hans looked at the photographs and knew they were real. You could not fake that much death, that much evil. Weber saw the reports and threw up. He locked himself in the library for 2 hours. When he came out, his face was gray. "I wore the uniform that did this," he said to Morrison. "I fought for them. I have an iron cross for serving monsters." "You did not know," Morrison said. "I should have known," Weber said. "The signs were there, the hate speeches, the laws against Jews, the violence. I chose not to see it because it was easier to believe the lies. That is almost worse than knowing." Fritz saw the photographs and said nothing for 3 days. Then he asked Robertson for paper. He wrote a letter he would never send, addressed to his Hitler Youth leader. Hans found the letter later, crumpled in the trash. "You told me Canadians were subhuman. You told me mercy was weakness. You told me our cause was righteous. I am 22 years old. I have 1 working leg. I have no family. and every single word you spoke was a lie designed to make me a weapon. The subhuman Canadians treated me better than you ever did. I am staying here because this inferior country is better than anything we built." Hans picked up the letter and smoothed it out. He showed it to Weber. Weber read it and nodded. "He is healing," Weber said. "Slowly, but he is healing." By August, Hans was writing letters home in English. Weber had filled 3 journals with his thoughts about propaganda and power, and what Germany must do to rebuild properly. Fritz had returned to work in the greenhouse and was helping new prisoners adjust to camp life. The 3 of them sat together most evenings talking about what came next. "I am staying," Hans said. "When they let us, I will apply to immigrate." "I must go home," Weber said. "Greta is waiting. My children need their father, but I will teach them everything I learned here." Fritz stared at his hands. "I will try to stay. I have nothing in Germany but rubble and shame. Here, maybe I can rebuild myself." Outside, summer faded toward fall. The war was over, the killing had stopped. Now came the harder work of healing, of learning, of becoming something better than what they had been. Not all of them would make it, but some would. And that was enough to start. September came, and with it news that made Hans's stomach tighten. Canada was beginning to send German prisoners home. Disabled veterans would go first. It was a humanitarian priority, they said. Hans should have felt relief. Instead, he felt dread mixed with a strange sadness. He had spent 16 months in this camp. 16 months learning that everything he thought he knew was wrong. Now he had to return to a country he no longer recognized as home. The authorities told them they would ship out in January. That gave Hans 4 months to prepare, 4 months to finish what he had started. In the carpentry shop, Hans worked on his final project, a desk for the local elementary school. He sanded the wood until it was smooth as glass. He carved his name on the bottom where no one would see it. Hans Miller, German POW, 1946. Then he added in careful English letters, "With gratitude." Henderson watched him work. On the last day, the old Canadian gave Hans his own set of carpentry tools. A hammer, 3 chisels, 2 saws, and a hand plane worn smooth by decades of use. Hans tried to refuse. These were Henderson's tools, his livelihood. But Henderson pressed them into Hans's hands and said something in English. Hans did not understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. "You will need these more than me." Hans cried. Henderson patted his shoulder and walked away, giving him privacy for his tears. Weber spent his final weeks organizing the library for the next prisoners. Japanese POWs would be arriving soon. Weber left notes in both German and English explaining how the system worked, which books were most popular, which shelves needed repair. He wrote it all down carefully, as if this small piece of order might help someone else find what he had found here. On his last day, Morrison gave Weber one final gift, a complete set of Shakespeare's plays in German translation. Weber held the heavy books like they were made of gold. "Why?" he asked. "Why give so much to your enemy?" Morrison smiled. "Because you are not my enemy anymore, Carl. You are my student, and a teacher's greatest joy is watching students grow." Weber broke then, he who had stayed controlled through everything, who had kept his emotions locked tight, put his face in his remaining hand and sobbed. Morrison stood beside him and waited until the storm passed. Fritz received a letter from Dr. Robertson. It was a medical recommendation describing Fritz's injuries and the treatment he had received. But it was more than that. It was also a character reference. Robertson wrote that Fritz had shown remarkable growth and rehabilitation. that he was a young man who had learned from his mistakes and deserved a second chance. The letter ended with an invitation. If Fritz ever wanted to return to Canada as an immigrant, Robertson would sponsor him. Fritz read the letter 5 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his only possession, a small bag that held everything he owned. The ship left Halifax in January 1946, the same route Hans had traveled 16 months earlier, but everything felt different now. 200 disabled prisoners crowded the deck as Canada disappeared behind them. Some men were quiet, others talked nervously. About 40% had already decided they wanted to return as immigrants. They spoke of applications they would file, of skills they would list, of the lives they hoped to build. Hans stood at the rail with Weber and Fritz. The 3 of them had shared a room on the way over. Now they shared this journey home. The Atlantic was just as cold and gray as before. But Hans was not the same man who had crossed it in terror. That Hans had been broken and afraid. This Hans was still broken in body, but something in his mind had healed. I spent 2 years fearing them, Haynes said. 16 months learning from them. Weber nodded. They defeated us twice, once with weapons, once with values. Fritz spoke quietly. I lost a leg in their war. I found my conscience in their camps. The crossing took 12 days. They ate the same food the crew ate. They slept in actual berths. They were treated like human beings right up until the moment they stepped off the ship in Liverpool. The British processed them quickly, gave them civilian clothes and a small amount of money, cleared them for travel, then put them on trains heading into Germany. Hans watched England pass by the windows, then France. The train moved slower as they got closer to Germany. Bombed tracks, temporary repairs. Everything took longer now. When they finally crossed the border into the British occupation zone, Hans pressed his face to the glass. Germany was destroyed. He had known it would be bad, but knowing and seeing were different things. Every city they passed was a skeleton. Buildings with no roofs, walls with no windows. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Refugees walked along the roads in long columns, pushing carts filled with everything they owned. People looked thin and gray and hopeless. Weber counted 8 destroyed bridges in 20 kilometers. Fritz saw the ruins of Cologne and could not find his childhood street. Everything was rubble. Just rubble and more rubble stretching in every direction. The train stopped at a processing camp. They would spend 1 night there before being released to find their own way home. Hans walked through the camp and could not believe what he saw. German civilians lived in worse conditions than he had in Medicine Hat. They slept on floors. They fought over scraps of food. There was no heat, even though it was winter. No organization. No hope. An old woman begged him for bread. Hans had none to give. He gave her his money instead, the few marks the British had provided. She clutched it and cried. That night, Hans lay on a cold floor and thought about his warm barrack in Alberta, about Henderson's shop and Morrison's library and Robertson's hospital, about hot coffee and butter on bread and beds with clean sheets. The prison camp in Canada had been paradise compared to this. Weber lay nearby, his journal pressed against his chest. Fritz sat with his back against a wall, staring at nothing. They were home, but home was gone. Everything they had known was ashes. Hans thought about Mackenzie's tools in his bag, about the English words he had learned, about the immigration papers he would file as soon as he could. Germany would need decades to rebuild. Hans did not have decades to wait. He had a life to live, and he knew now where he wanted to live it. In the darkness, Fritz whispered, "Was any of it real? Or did we dream it?" "It was real," Weber said. "That is the only reason we survived this. Morning came cold and gray. They received their discharge papers. Now they were free to go wherever they wanted in occupied Germany. Hans would head to Bavaria to find his mother. Weber would go to Prussia, though Prussia belonged to Poland now. Fritz would try Hamburg. They stood together one last time before separating. "When you get to Canada," Weber said to Hans, "write to me. Tell me it is still real." Hans promised. They shook hands. Then they walked in different directions into a broken country, carrying tools and books and letters, carrying memories of kindness, carrying proof that another way was possible. Hans found his mother in a refugee camp outside Munich. She was alive, but looked 20 years older than when he had left. Her house in Bavaria was gone, destroyed by bombs. She had walked for 2 weeks to reach the camp. When she saw Hans limping toward her on his Canadian-made prosthetic leg, she collapsed into his arms. "You are alive," she whispered. "I thought I would never see you again." Hans held her and felt her bones through her thin dress. She weighed maybe 90 pounds. He had been eating better as a prisoner than she had as a free woman. That thought made him sick with guilt. He worked as a carpenter in Munich for 2 years. The city needed to be rebuilt. There was work for men with skills, even men with one leg. Hans used Henderson's tools every day. The hammer felt right in his hand. The saws cut true. He built houses from rubble. He made doors and window frames. He earned enough money to feed his mother and save a little. In 1947, Hans applied for Canadian immigration. He listed his carpentry skills. He included letters from Henderson and Mackenzie. He wrote about his time in Medicine Hat. 6 months later, his application was approved. His mother cried when he told her. But she also smiled. "You found a good place," she said. "Go and be happy. That is all I want for you." Hans sailed to Canada in March 1948. Corporal Mackenzie met him at the dock in Halifax. The two men shook hands, then hugged. Mackenzie helped Hans get to Medicine Hat, helped him find work, helped him start his carpentry business. Within a year, Hans was earning good money building cabinets and furniture. In 1950, Hans married a German-Canadian woman named Anna. She had immigrated with her family before the war. They had 3 children together. Hans named his first son Kenneth, after Mackenzie. Every night, Hans told his children about the camp, about kindness when hate would have been easier, about building instead of destroying. His children grew up knowing that their father had learned about being human from people who had every right to be inhuman. Weber returned to Prussia and found his wife living in a crowded apartment with other refugees. The Soviets controlled their homeland now. Everything they owned was gone. But Greta was alive, and their children were alive. That was enough. They moved to West Germany in 1947. Weber became a teacher in a small town near Stuttgart. He taught history and civic education. He focused on teaching students how to think, not what to think, how to recognize propaganda, how to question authority, how to see when they were being manipulated. Weber never hid what he had learned as a prisoner. He wrote an article in 1949 called "What I Learned from My Captors." It was published in a teaching journal. Later, parts of it appeared in textbooks. Students read about how the enemy had shown more humanity than Germany's own leaders, about how real strength meant choosing mercy. Weber visited Canada 3 times, in 1960, 1970, and 1979. Each time he stayed with Morrison's family. Morrison had retired, but they remained friends until Morrison died in 1973. Weber's grandchildren studied at Canadian universities. They learned English and brought home ideas about democracy and freedom. Weber died in 1987 at age 78. His journals were published after his death. The book was called From Iron Cross to Moral Compass. It is still used in German schools today. Fritz struggled the most. He settled in Hamburg with no family and no connections. For 2 years, he worked construction despite his limp. He fought depression. Some days, he could barely get out of bed. But he remembered what Dr. Robertson had said. You can waste your life on guilt or use it to do good. Fritz started volunteering with refugee aid organizations. Germany was full of displaced people, orphaned children, families torn apart by war. Fritz helped them find food, shelter, documents. He was especially good with orphans. He understood what it felt like to have nothing and no one. In 1951, Fritz applied for Canadian immigration. Dr. Robertson sponsored him as promised. Fritz moved to Edmonton and got a job at a greenhouse, the same kind of work he had done in the camp. The smell of soil and growing things brought him peace. He never married. Never had children, but he helped hundreds of refugees settle in Canada, Vietnamese families in the 1970s, Eastern Europeans in the 1980s. He gave them what Canada had given him, a second chance. In July 1970, Hans organized a reunion, 25 years since the war ended. He contacted everyone he could find from Medicine Hat Camp. 40 former prisoners came to Alberta. Weber flew from Germany with his wife and 2 of his children. Fritz took a bus from Edmonton. Mackenzie came, now 55 and retired. Morrison came, visiting from Toronto. Dr. Robertson came, giving lectures at the university. They gathered in Medicine Hat at a community center. Old men now, with gray hair and slow movements. But when they saw each other, something sparked. Memories flooded back. Hans and Weber embraced. Fritz shook hands with Robertson and could not speak for a full minute. A local television crew filmed interviews. The story ran on national news. "Former enemies, lifelong friends," the headline said. Hans told the camera about Henderson's tools. Weber talked about Morrison's books. Fritz described how Robertson had saved not just his leg, but his soul. Mackenzie spoke about his brother Tommy, who died at Dieppe, about choosing mercy over revenge. "That was who we were," he said, "not perfect, but we tried to prove our values were worth fighting for." 15 years later, in 1985, the Canadian government held a ceremony in Ottawa. They honored former prisoners of war who had immigrated and contributed to Canadian society. Hans was 69 now. Weber was 76. Fritz was 63. 15 former Medicine Hat prisoners still lived. They stood together in Parliament while officials spoke about reconciliation and healing. Hans donated Henderson's tools to the Canadian War Museum. Weber donated his journals to the National Archives. Fritz donated his medical records showing Canadian care. Together, they read a statement. "We came to Canada as enemies, broken and filled with lies. We returned to Germany as changed men. We came back to Canada as immigrants because this country showed us what civilization truly means. Not victory without mercy, not justice without compassion, but the radical idea that even your enemies deserve dignity. That broke us free from hatred more effectively than any weapon. This is the Canada that defeated fascism, not just with soldiers, but with values. May these values never be forgotten." Hans died in 1992 in Medicine Hat, surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His obituary called him a humble carpenter with an extraordinary story. The whole community came to his funeral. Mackenzie, now 77, attended with his son, who spoke about how Hans had reminded Canadians of their best selves. Weber died in Stuttgart in 1987. 2 generations of former students attended his funeral. They spoke about how he had taught them to think critically, to question, to never blindly follow. His final journal entry sat on display at the service. Fritz died in Edmonton in 1996. He He donated his body to medical science, his last act of giving. Hundreds attended his memorial service. Vietnamese families he had helped spoke about his kindness. The greenhouse where he had worked was renamed Klein Memorial Garden in 1997. Weber's final journal entry, written weeks before he died, said everything that needed to be said. I have lived 78 years, 26 as a German soldier believing lies, 16 months as a Canadian prisoner learning truth, 41 years trying to teach others what my captors taught me. The true measure of civilization is not how it treats its heroes, but how it treats its defeated enemies. The Canadians won World War II on battlefields, but they won something greater in the camps of Alberta. They proved that humanity could triumph over hatred, even when hatred seemed justified. They showed that the enemy is not the man in the other uniform, but the ideology that sent him there. We came to them as Nazis. We left as human beings. That transformation, that mercy when vengeance was expected, that education when punishment was justified, that kindness when cruelty would have been understandable, that was their greatest victory. And it became our salvation. May future generations remember that breaking the cycle of hatred requires more courage than continuing it. The Canadians had that courage. They gave it to us, and we tried to give it to others. Of the 800 disabled German prisoners who passed through Medicine Hat Camp, 214 eventually immigrated to Canada. They became teachers, tradesmen, business owners, community leaders. Their children and grandchildren are Canadian citizens today. The camp's approach influenced how the world treats prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened based partly on the Canadian model. The greatest victory in war is not defeating your enemy. It is proving your values were worth fighting for. Those disabled German prisoners expected death or torture. Instead, they received dignity, medical care, education, and kindness. That unexpected humanity did not just disarm them, it transformed them. It broke the cycle of hatred and proved that even those who fought for evil could become forces for good when shown a better way. Cruelty breeds more cruelty, but mercy, especially mercy toward those who expect none, can change the world one transformed heart at a time. That is the legacy. That is what we must remember.